WPT simply defines any technology which allows electricity, power, to go from one point to another without passing through wires. I'm sure some of you, at least like me, were subjected to a field trip to the Boston Museum of Science when they were in the 6th grade and saw the Tesla coils. That would qualify as WPT as far as transmission goes, because it is power being projected. The big hurdle with WPT is power received. How do you get your cell phone to charge without it exploding, which is what would happen in a Tesla coil? How do you get particularly one person's cell phone to charge when not someone else's phone to charge? How do you deliver the intended voltage? And how do you deliver the intended voltage over a particular range? The technology today is in its extreme infancy. Wireless power transfer, the only technology that is currently really commercially available is something called the Qi technology. Basically, it looks like a hot plate, and if you lay your phone on it, it charges your phone. You don't have to plug it in, but that's pretty much the only thing that it saves you is the necessity of plugging in your phone. It's not going to change the world as it stands, and nor does it really bring into consideration any of the broader energy laws we've talked about. It doesn't call for regulation. If you move your phone 6 inches away, your phone isn't going to charge. However, there has been, according to industry rumors, several $100 million invested in the development of wireless power technology which will be more efficient and be able to be implemented on a larger scale. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But hundreds of millions of dollars has been invested. The investment in one startup dealing with WPT is larger than the initial investment in Facebook, and it's been made by the same person, Peter Thiel. People take this seriously, and it's expected to play a major role in the future, particularly of American and the developed world's electricity, but it could also have an effect on the electrical usage of the underdeveloped world, which has not thus far had a major grid. It seems a little bit outlandish, the idea that you can charge your cell phone or even a larger device from across the room without a wire, but I will submit to you that 30 years ago it seemed pretty outlandish that you could use a telephone without it being plugged into a wire in the wall, and now we can use our telephones wherever we want. That's what the future of WPT is. It's electricity for any device without having to plug it in anywhere in the world. I've developed a schema for the analysis of this. I should point out at first that there's very little written on this subject, and there's nothing that I can find on the legal implications of WPT in specific. So what I've tried to do is cull together the various topics of energy law and other things that we've discussed in law school to try to analyze what the legal ramifications of WPT shall be. It's a bit theoretical, but it's led to some interesting pathways, at least I think they're interesting. The analytical schema I've developed is a logarithmic scale of range, which is determined to be the most important variable in the development of the technology. Right now, the range is 0 meters. Your phone has to be on the hot plate for it to charge. Not going to change the world. At 1 meter, at 10 meters, at 100 meters, and at 1,000 meters, things change at a perceptible level. For example, at 1 meter. If WPT gets to the point where you can reliably charge small devices at 1 meter away, that means you could have a WPT station, think a wireless router, a Linksys box, at a point in your home, and everything within approximately 3 feet on every side could be charged, could operate off of the electricity emanating from that box. This would have primarily residential applications. It would mean that instead of having an outlet every couple of feet along your wall, you could simply have a little charging station. It would eliminate the need for you plugging things in your home. I'm not a very technological guy in general, but I counted that there are 8 electric devices in my kitchen alone, all of which have long, cumbersome, annoying wires. And for those who are home stereo enthusiasts or who have 7 Xboxes, there are a lot of wires that can be generated. The only real practical application of this is would require that devices be redesigned so that they wouldn't need wires anymore. That being said, this doesn't, I think, rise to the level of energy law. These are private residential uses. It doesn't affect the power grid as a whole. And it's expected by a lot of analysts that this sort of technology will be available within the next 3 to 5 years. Within the next 10 to 20 years, it's suggested that the technology will get to the level of approximately another order of magnitude, 10 meters of range. What this means is one unit could power the entirety of a small apartment. Every single device in your apartment could run off of one little box in the corner. Suddenly this gets to the point where it's a lot more efficient, but it's not really going to impact the power grid as a whole. You might talk about the duties of designing apartments or designing individual pieces of technology, or even your rice cooker or coffee maker, in order to adapt to this technology, but it's not going to require, I think it's not going to affect interstate commerce to a substantive level. However, when you start getting to approximately 100 meters, yes, thank you, orders of magnitude check, you start to get to the point where the WPT can start to replace what we think of as higher voltage energy lines, like power lines which are outside. At 100 meters, 300 feet, you could have a WPT box on every street corner in a residential neighborhood, for example, and that could power all of the electronic devices within those houses in that neighborhood. You would essentially make power lines unnecessary and obsolete. It would work primarily at a, a residential or at a residential level, whether it be urban, suburban, or rural, particularly suburban and rural, where houses are more tightly clumped together. That being said, it would only replace the very last stage of power delivery. Power, as we've talked about, power starts at the power plant at a very high voltage, coming out these gigantic wires, gets smaller and smaller until, as far as voltage goes, until it gets to your house where it's the point where it can charge your rice cooker or your cell phone. This would replace the very last stage. And there are some legal implications there, particularly if WPT comes about and not only people demand it, or of course decide that there is an actual duty, or if the legislature creates a duty to replace wires at a residential level with WPT stations. I think the most likely challenge to this will be under the guise of property law, whether the installation of such devices constitutes a trespass under teleprompter, or whether the emanations from WPT stations constitute trespass. And we'll get to that in just a moment. The largest order of magnitude is where things get really interesting as far as a true reevaluation of the power grid, and that's at the 1,000 meter, or the 1 kilometer range. That's the point where you can start projecting power over a sufficient distance, assuming that there's line of sight probably, that it could really replace elements of the power grid as we know it. It wouldn't affect generation directly, but as far as the transmission of power, it would have a tremendous effect. You wouldn't need high voltage lines anymore, or you certainly wouldn't need them within the confines of communities. They could exist in rural areas, connecting distant power plants to cities. Within the cities, it would free up the grid. The Department of Energy has stopped, to my best research, publishing statistics on how much of the United States is covered in power lines since 2001, because they're potential terrorist targets, I assume. However, there's a study that was released in 1996 talking about how much of the United States is covered in power lines, and it's a lot. In 1996, it was 180,000 miles of power lines existed in the continental United States alone. Sorry, 50 states alone. And it said this was expected to grow to about 200,000 miles by the year 2000. Extrapolating, just generally, call it 200,000 miles of power lines, and it then talked about how wide the lines had to be, how much of an easement was required, or how much of a right-of-way. And it was anywhere from 30 feet for these tiny little residential lines, between 15 feet on either side, would have to be cleared to keep the lines from being interrupted by falling trees and to allow them to be serviced, to 150 feet for rural lines, to 300 feet of a right-of-way for high voltage transmission lines, such as those that come out of nuclear power plants. If anyone's ever been, mountain biking in the woods or something, and suddenly there's a 300-foot wide clearing and extremely tall lines, those carry the highest possible voltage, and as a result, they need to be kept very well clear of obstructions and people who could touch them. I think we read that case in Torts. The WPT technology at a very high level would free up, therefore, I'm talking about an average, I said, of about 100 to 150 feet, 200,000 miles, something like 5,000 square miles of the United States, for an estimation, which is roughly 3.5 times the size of the state of Rhode Island. Suddenly, just from a property standpoint, you've created a huge amount of land that is no longer needed for its current use. However, the legal regimes which cover the land underneath power lines is complex and varies from place to place. In some places it is city land, in some places it is state or federal land, in some places, and in such an instance it would either be leased to power companies, which can be under various terms, or they can have more commonly there's an easement or right of way. And the regime which governs access to those lines, the guys in hard hats repairing these lines, varies whether it's an implied easement or whether they actually have to purchase those rights. Oftentimes power lines, even the larger ones, cut through people's private land, and oftentimes, particularly when you're talking about like paper easements when a subdivision is created, things which have never been tested in the real world, sometimes the power line has been over a person's land or a privately owned parcel of land for 100 years, and its legal situation as to whether it's an easement or not has never been clarified. Suddenly, all these lines are going to be going away, which means their ownership will have to be better determined to see who can own the land underneath them, which means who has the right to develop it. I expect that there would be an incredible amount of suits to quiet title based upon this alteration. There are, certainly at the level when you're talking about power projection over a kilometer or more, you start to get to the point where you're replacing the energy grid as we know it. And facially, you'd think that this would call for an entirely new regime of laws. That being said, WPT, while it can free up this space, and it can be useful because you don't have to deal with USB cables, it doesn't change the fundamental nature of power transfer. At that level, you're simply replacing the wired power grid with an unwired power grid, but I see no reason why the laws which govern the United States power grid should not apply equally well. The regulation by FERC is based primarily upon trying to ensure safety and equal access to the power grid, to create it as a common carrier and prevent the development of monopolies and allow for efficient rate setting. These would apply equally well to a power grid that wasn't wired. I'm not sure if wireless power transfer technology companies are aware of this. I get the impression, based upon looking at their business plans, the fundraising pitches that they put together, that they believe when they sell these power transfer units, they're going to have complete control over dominion over that power. I don't think they realize that at a certain level they're going to qualify for federal regulation, and they're certainly going to deserve it. If most of the federal laws and the delegated rulemaking that was created around regulating the power lines, I keep pointing to the power lines, I don't know if you can see it, I can. It was based around the idea that power lines were usually built by the companies who were building power plants. That transmission and generation were part of the same industry. That, of course, over the last 30 years particularly, has separated a great deal as the government has tried to create the grid into quasi-public property. Wireless power transfer companies should therefore do very well to be advised that just because they're putting in this new technology does not mean that they are going to own a private energy grid. As long as people can commonly access this grid, they are going to be subject to the same regulations that the power grid owners are under now, particularly 888 and 889. Which brings us to a fifth order of magnitude, which has not generally been envisioned by the startup companies. However, I think it's worth considering. I mentioned earlier in talking about going from a wired telephone to a cell phone. With this technology, there is no reason to think that you will not be able to have satellite projection of power. I know it sounds like how G.I. Joe would describe a new technology, but I think that it's within 20 or 30 years at most. The differences between the waves which are projected by a satellite in order to provide digital information to your cell phone and electricity is ad absurdum. It's a matter of degree. the technology is there. And what that means is that a satellite in geosynchronous orbit over a power generation station, I'm thinking particularly nuclear, will be able to project power to other places. This means that you can power your cell phone anywhere that you can get a cell phone reception, which in my case is anywhere but my house. The particular benefit of this is that the satellites will not actually have a power generation aboard them. They would simply be reflective stations, which means there'd be less plutonium in low Earth orbit, and if anyone wants to Google plutonium in low Earth orbit, there's really a lot of it from satellites that have their own power, mostly Russian, but not entirely. It would allow for power projection. There's a concept in power transmission called impedance. The longer the wire, the more charge it loses. So, and as a result, nuclear power plants have to be, particularly nuclear, I'm picking on nuclear, have to be close to the population centers that they serve. This is problematic for reasons that hardly need to be belabored. Putting nuclear power plants in population centers has been one of the biggest difficulties in their construction. This technology could allow nuclear power plants to be placed farther away from population centers, which could make them considerably more safe. For certain values of the word safe. The other big variables in WPT are, outside of range, which I think is the most important, are efficiency, how you can send power over great distances, and targetability. Now, the problem with WPT analysis at this stage is that A, I'm not an engineer, B, none of the startups have released their engineering documents, and C, it hasn't been invented yet, even if they wanted to. So talking about how efficient these technologies are going to be is somewhat absurd at this point. However, the people manufacturing these technologies are all for-profit companies. One can relatively expect that the invisible hand of the market will guide them to create good technologies, and otherwise they will never be commercially released and so won't have legal implications. The targeting, however, I think is going to be extremely important. By that I mean, let's say there's a WPT station with a 1 meter range. One person on the left, one person on the right, both want to charge their cell phones. If it's simply creating a magnetic field which provides power, both of those people will be able to charge their cell phones indistinctly. This will be great when you're at a bar and everyone wants to charge their phone. You don't have to ask the bartender for their iPhone charger. The problem is that power isn't free, and if it is indiscriminate in the ability to power all devices, if it cannot discriminate between the devices it's powering, WPT will essentially create only energy that can be given away for free. This is the same problem that early wireless routers had. Everyone used everyone else's internet. What happened there was simply that we password protected them. And as a result, you could only get access to the router if you had the password. I think the same technology will have to be developed for WPT. I cannot imagine how they're going to do it, but I can't imagine how a wireless router works either. This brings us to some interesting questions regarding particularly trespass. If you have a WPT box in your house, even if the technology is at its early stage, we're at like the 10-meter stage, if it's in your apartment and the apartment next door can pick up your signal, are you trespassing onto their property? I think the answer is probably no in general, since you would have to voluntarily access that electricity in order to make use of it. I think that very rapidly there will probably be the development of such like password protection technology, which would provide a best technology argument that you are protecting it. And generally speaking, in order for there to be trespass upon someone else's property, there has to be a physical manifestation or an actual interference. This doesn't really offer either. It's basically the same thing as radio is. Just because the neighbor can pick up WBLM does not necessarily mean that WBLM is trespassing, or so courts held in 1915. The question comes then for the reverse of that argument. Person A has a wireless power transfer station in their home, so the energy that's going into that station is energy that they're paying for from central main power. Person B gets access to that, either because it's not encrypted yet, or because they've broken the encryption, or through something else. Is that stealing? Generally speaking, I think the real analogous cases here are wireless internet, which the courts have generally held that if you take reasonable efforts to protect your wireless, which I think is equivalent to the best technology standards that are often set by FERC and other agencies, and someone else breaks into your internet, they are at fault. Punishments are mild, but they can be punished. They don't have to actually interfere with your internet. They don't have to take anything away from you. Just the fact that they're using something that is yours makes them at fault. I think this argument can be traced back to really early property law cases, to Gen v. Rich, for those of us who consulted their property law while writing this paper, which just simply states that the creation of a technology, the building of it, affords you a certain amount of legal protections. If you have a wireless power transfer station and someone else is using your power, chances are you can get them to desist at the very least. And that's outside of any more specific regulations being passed. The complicated question would probably arise in tort. Certainly a lot of people on Reddit, when they think about wireless power transfer technology, they think, oh God, someone's going to plug their WPT station into their house and my house next door, the computer's going to explode. In general, I like to think that because these technologies are being developed by for-profit companies, that won't happen by the time they get to market. And if such things happen, they will usually be developed, a case against them in general product liability and tort. An interesting question arises, though, when it's not a matter of the next door neighbor's computer bursting into flames, but what happens if you provide a power surge to the next door neighbor and their technology stops working properly? You wipe their hard drive. By the creation of a large magnetic field, you interfere with the sensitive materials that a person is, say your next door neighbor has a floppy disk collection on their wall. You could interfere with that collection. Don't move in next to those people. The question then becomes, can a non-physical invasion of someone else's property, which results in non-physical damage, doesn't burst into flames, the data disappears on those disks, can that result in liability? And as much as it pains me to say it, I think the case on point here is CompuServe from our Civil Procedure 2 class, and you'd have to look back to the original forms of action to determine whether this actually constitutes trespass. I think in the modern world, chances are it would constitute civil but not criminal trespass. When you start also bringing discussions of WPT to a larger level, to a grander scale, you talk about having it replace the nation's energy grid entire, you start discussing, particularly less in America maybe, but more in countries which are in closer proximity to lots of other countries, but I'm thinking Europe particularly, that kind of interference across state lines, you have to wonder, would that constitute an international crime? And the short answer is this is a really touchy point of international law which no one can agree on. There are several definitions go out there as to what constitutes a non-physical invasion that results in non-physical but quantifiable damage. Generally, this refers to hacking, which is, to put it kind of abstrusely, hacking is the use of information to cause non-physical changes. But what we're talking about, using power to cause non-physical changes, I think the two are basically analogous. That overloading another person's computer so that it wipes the data is basically the same as what a lot of violent hackers would want to do. And I'm aware that no one said hacker since 1995, but I'm using it anyway, colloquially. Under the Tallinn Manual, which deals with cyber crimes, which was published in Estonia in the wake of the attacks by, it's generally considered to be Russia against Estonia in about 2008, they proposed that, and even those people had been attacked by hackers, their computer systems had been wiped. Even in that situation, the definition they proposed for a cybercrime was something which has to have a physical component. So if a hacker were to wipe every computer in America from a foreign country, that would not constitute a crime sufficient to go to war. If a hacker hacked into an American GPS on someone's Mazda and caused it to run into a tree, that would be a physical manifestation of the interference, and that would be sufficient to go to war. I think that probably that same logic, at least outside of legislation to the contrary, would apply to criminal standards in America at a national level, which is that your use of this technology, intentional or otherwise, caused an interference with someone else's data. They could sue you for the damages, but they probably would not rise to the level of a crime. I think this is probably really good news for wireless power transfer technologies. It would eliminate any possibility of their corporate criminal liability and further penalties. The largest implications for this technology is going to be to within the next 10 years, is going to be to residential consumers. Probably this technology will be purchased on an individual level. So if you want wireless power in your house, you will have to buy the unit. If you don't want it, you don't buy it, it doesn't affect you. However, I expect that within the next 20 or 30 years, that's going to change. In the same way that cell phones have begun to dominate the market, it will not be possible to escape this technology. The market forces will probably be sufficient to make the technology efficient, reliable, and safe as possible. That being said, when it starts to replace the energy grid, these companies are going to suffer liability to federal regulations, the same as any company which strings wires through our neighborhoods. As a result, I think companies would be extremely well advised to focus not just on product liability and not just on fundraising, but on the implications of energy law to their technology. Thank you for letting me talk fast at you for a while. I will do my best to answer your questions. Zach.
Does wireless power cause cancer?
Probably. So, 2 points to your question. The first is, we still don't know exactly which wireless power transfer technology is going to be adopted, so it's really difficult to start talking about potential health risks. When one or more technologies are out there, I like to think that there'll be two or more and they can fight over each other, like early AC and DC power, but that's because I like Nikola Tesla. We will have to see what the health effects are. There are two ways that this can be approached. Number one is simply you let the technology run rampant, and if we find 10 or 20 years later that there is health or safety concerns, there's a lot of work for trial lawyers, which is essentially it's a electromagnetic radiation equivalent of toxic torts. This is, to be perfectly honest, I think this is the way that a lot of technology at the industrial scale relating to energy law is done. There's not nearly enough prior testing to protect individuals. That being said, the law has found that these remedies are sufficient to treat problems after the fact. The other way to go about it would be to rigorously test these technologies before they go to market. The problem there is that it slows things down, it imposes a large cost burden upon the companies who are producing the technology. And a lot of the companies that are producing this technology are 6 guys in a basement in Silicon Valley somewhere who don't have enough resources to do that kind of giant industry-wide testing as you would see in like a major car company or a pharmaceutical company testing a drug. And this technology, particularly as it gets more advanced, could really be beneficial, could really help people. I think there's a great application for it in the underdeveloped nations who don't have a power grid. They can go directly from not having a grid to having an efficient modern grid. You've seen a lot of this in Central Africa, for example, where people went right from no telephone access to having cell phones and skipped the need for landlines entirely. I think it's the scary truth of that logic, however, is that as has been known to happen from time to time, the developed world will use the underdeveloped world as guinea pigs for their new technology. And we will determine whether it's safe by looking at Africans, which I don't think is the way that foreign policy should be conducted in this country. I think it's perfectly reasonable for the government to, probably through FERC, to require a certain amount of safety testing before these technologies are put into play. However, FERC has to act now if they're going to, because these technologies, you can already put your cell phone down on a little hot plate and charge it. It's really just an order of magnitude that it's going to increase by, and I expect, as I said, within 3 to 5 years, it's going to be in people's homes. Nerds' homes, yes, but people's homes. if FERC wants to start regulating this technology at an a priori level, if they want to make sure it goes through rigorous testing to see if it's safe and healthy, they need to require that now. They need to pass laws which require that now. Otherwise, by the time they get around to that kind of rulemaking, the devices will already be out there. It will be too late. Yes, sir?
I have a question about the level of impedance. How does it compare, or are there any guesses as to how it compares with wireless as opposed to traditional wired power transfer?
There's two ways to analyze that question, which yields completely antithetical results. The first one is that the impedance that you find in highly conductive materials, copper wire being the most common, sometimes use gold for really sensitive materials, comes from the fact that the power is passing through a physical medium. And as a result, it's impossible to get away from some impedance. Even the most efficient power lines lose some power. And wireless power transfer, on the other hand, by virtue of the fact that it's simply propagating waves through the air, which is really close to a vacuum in comparison to copper, you probably wouldn't have that same level of impedance. On the other hand, when we're talking about like a 1 meter or 10 meters that you can get within a transfer station to charge a phone, for example, that's a huge sphere, or hemisphere, around the power station. That's power going in every direction, whereas power lines are single point to point. So I think that what the way the technology will probably develop is that for residential or public park use, any place you find public power outlets or public wireless, it will be little boxes for multiple people to use small devices around them, which will be pretty inefficient, but these things run on 5 volts and they don't need to be that efficient. The real technological development is going to be for using power to cross long distances point to point, not by creating fields of utility for individual users, but by actually transmitting power in the same way that high voltage lines are used now. Yeah, when you're talking about point to point, it's less of a sphere, nebulous sphere of energy, and more of a beam. You're talking about, metaphorically, laser precision. And in that instance, you're propagating power through essentially a vacuum. As long as it's not raining out, you're doing very well. I don't want to even think about what happens if it's raining out, or if you live in Seattle and it's always kind of raining out. We'll just figure that out in post. It's one of the reasons why satellite technology, on the other hand, is so useful when you're talking about WPT. The more that satellites are involved in this kind of projection, the less atmosphere is involved, because it's only a couple miles straight up to space. But if you're talking about crossing hundreds of miles of the atmosphere, the couple of miles to space has less total atmosphere that you're crossing. It does also lend comparison to wireless projection. Wireless projection, every year for the last 20 years, I think, or so, there's been a gathering of computer security professionals in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's called DEF CON because you get to name your own convention. And at DEF CON, every year since it's starting, they've had a contest. Who can project a wireless internet signal the farthest? And as I say, I think the technology between wireless internet and wireless power transfer is very similar, at least by analogy. They stopped this contest a couple of years ago because essentially we as a species won. In the extremely dry climate of Nevada, on a good day, you can project a wireless signal using like $200 worth of parts and not that much power, 80 miles. The only reason you can't project it further is because the curvature of the Earth. Very good. So we've really reached the point where that is as far as a linear beam at point-to-point radiation can travel. That is sort of an ideal situation, mainly because you're in the middle of the desert, there's not much there, and the atmospheric conditions are great. I think, therefore, that WPT is going to be more useful in general, at least at the initial stages, in places that have similar climates, which is rural areas and places with conducive climates. That being said, there's going to be a lot of money in this, a lot of money. when you start coming to replacing every single power line on a street corner, there's just going to be a huge amount of cash. And I think therefore the technology is going to develop like gangbusters once it gets out in the world. Is it?
Two quick affected parties by this, and see if I've got it right. One, the rural Maine residence owner. Basically good news. I'm less trouble that the distribution line right outside my house goes down in the ice storm, and Central Maine Power doesn't get out for 4 days to get it fixed up.
I think initially, the rural user, Maine's a great example, won't be as affected when the devices are smaller, when they're just in people's houses, and or when they're at a neighborhood level. You're going to find that they're used the most in places of high population density, just by virtue of the fact that it's more efficient to so do. However, once the technology is developed to the point where it can be used for actual point-to-point power transmission, yes, I think the rural Maine dweller is going to be the most affected because high transmission voltage power lines are going to be a thing of the past. They will be the ones who will get access to freed up land, and they will be the ones who no longer have to worry about cancer clusters and other associated risks from high voltage lines.
My other affected group is Joe or Jane terrorist. Does this reduce their opportunity to do damage to the United States infrastructure?
It's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. Could probably. It has been noted that.
You're welcome to mull on that if you want, but
That power, off the top of my head, power transfer stations are usually marked as extremely high risk sections for terrorists. On the one hand, it would prevent, this kind of technology could allow for really easy redundancy, particularly when you start talking about satellite usage. It puts it out away from terrorists and allows the possibility of, in case one satellite is damaged, easily redirecting power output to a different satellite without having to deal with all sorts of messy facts on the ground. On the other hand, basically WPT is creating a lot of big boxes where what we currently have is a lot of wires. It's simply easier to blow up a box than a wire. So not only terrorism, but even a mechanical failure, I think it centralizes things and might make it a bit more of a risk. Interesting.
David, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Presentation. Bingham.
I think solar flares would really mess it up.
Yeah, we don't talk about those.
Capture them.
May I start it?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Minkyoung Choi. My topic is Hydropower. First, I will start with a little bit of factor background of hydropower, and I'll focus on the bigger framework of hydropower, and then lastly, I'll explain a little bit about future development of hydropower. So, the hydropower is really meaning the force of moving water that generate electricity with just we call that is a hydroelectricity. Currently, according to 2014 data, hydropower contributed to about 7% of the U.S. total electricity generation. But then for the recent years, because of the rapid growth in the natural gases and other renewable technologies, hydropower share of electricity has been gradually declined. And although the hydropower is generally known as clean energy sources because they're using the water cycle itself does not create any toxic or greenhouse gases, but then construction and operation of hydropower plants can cause a serious negative impact on the natural environment. Basically, there are three types of hydropower plants. The first one is impoundment, and second is a diversion or run over river, and third one is pumped storage. Impoundment is the most common and conventional type using a dam to generate electricity. We call such a dam as a hydropower dam. According to the 2013 National Inventory Dam Database, there are about 87,000 dams in the U.S., but then only 3% of those generate electricity. Because of a key element of hydropower is really water availability, which is really different from place to place. I added some picture. You can see how hydropower plants are spread unevenly. Particularly hydropower plants are located on Columbia River Basin in the Pacific Northwest region has been contribute to about 44% of the total hydroelectricity in the U.S. On the other hand, in many parts of the Northeast region, they lack of generated electricity capacity to satisfy customer demand, so they have been relying on the imported hydroelectricity from Canada. Now I will go started a little bit of I focus on the federal law and regulation, how they affected the development of a hydropower plant. Federal water power plant, which passed in 1920, we now known as Federal Power Act. This was the first and the primary federal statute governing hydropower development. This act created the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, independent federal agency. Under this act, the commission has exclusive jurisdiction over non-federally owned hydropower project. When I say hydropower project, that means generally refers to a project that a river or water resource is used as a fuel to generate electricity. There are three main responsibility of the commission. First is the commission may issue a license or exemption from the licensing requirement, and second is the commission may renew a license for the continuation of the existing license, and third one is the commission has a duty to oversee ongoing project operation. For the detail of each of the responsibility, although rivers are the public resources, any interested party from the private or public sector, they can obtain a license for the privilege of operating a hydropower plant on the river. Controlling standard for determining the issuance of licenses, whether a particular hydropower project is best adapted to serve the public interest, such as the future electricity demand and the preservation of wild rivers. Basically, a license provides terms and conditions regarding how hydropower constructed and operated and maintained. Generally, licenses granted for typically for 30 to 50 years. This similarly long license period is generally considered as necessary to give licenses who have time to realize economic profit from their investment. Maybe before their project may be turned into the federal government when they fail to renew licenses. And also, although the commission has the sole authority to issue a license, the licensing process involves multiple steps in decision making, not only by federal state agency, but also a broader range of non-government authority who seek to influence the licensing process. In addition to issuing a license, the commission may also issue an exemption from the licensing requirement. That's only in the certain circumstances. Generally, there are two types of exemption. First one is the small hydropower project, which means they generate electricity only about 5 megawatts or less. And then the second type is a conduit hydropower project. And the second responsibility, the commission may involve a relicensing process. Basically, the relicensing process allows the commission to receive a recommendation from relevant state and federal authority regarding the improvement of the public resources. For example, the quality of the water released from a dam. Consequently, the commission determines whether they should renew a license without or with the modification of the terms and condition, or they may deny to renew it. Although relicensing process applies only to the already existing owners, but then the process really considered as a new really new one, like the one applies to the new applicant. Also, they may require competition with other licensed applicants. There's some significant reason behind why relicensing requires complex and lengthy regulatory process. That's because the original license had been issued long before major environmental laws was passed in 1970s. So the original license terms and conditions were generally designed to benefit only for the electricity generation, so without consideration on the how license impact on the natural environment. In actually, in the early 1990s, when many of the originally licensed dams began to expire, the existing owners faced a relatively high burden to meet certain standards, which are really different from those at the time they got the licenses. As a major environmental laws affecting the licensing, also a relicensing process, I listed maybe 4, but there are many others. First one is the Electric Consumer Protection Act, which is the amendment to the Federal Power Act. And second one is the National Environmental Policy Act. And third one is Clean Water Act. And the last one is Endangered Species Act. Basically, the first one is ECPA, the Protection Act, requires the Commission to evaluate both the non-power value and power value when issuing the license. And the National Environmental Policy Act requires the Commission to prepare environmental document, typically environmental assessment for the relicensing, and then a full environmental impact statement for a new licenses. And also under Clean Water Act, a commission before issuing a new license must receive a water quality certification from the state from relative water state water quality agency. According to the 1994 Supreme Court decision, that provide the states have authority to establish the minimum stream flow requirement as a condition for proposed hydropower project. And the last one is the Endangered Species Act. Basically, they provided the threatened species of animal, so the commission should make sure that the license does not jeopardize the continuous existence of the species. And the last one, the commission has a oversight responsibility. The key top priority for the commission is the dam safety. So for this duty, the commission directs an independent consultant to inspect hydropower plant on a regular basis before, during, and after the construction of dam. And with regard to the dam safety, there was almost no attention from federal and state government until the 1970s, in which a series of large dam failure occurred, threatening human lives and causing damage to property and environment. Although in 1920s, the California passed the first environmental law, but until in 1970 there was no particular environmental law. In response to some of the larger dam failure in 1972, Congress passed the National Dam Inspection Act. This is the initial basis of the federal dam safety legislation. And this act created the National Inventory of Dams database, which provides updated information on dams nationwide, and also classifying them by their potential hazard so as to indicate potential of dam failure. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a responsibility to update the information. And also, there was in 1980, Interagency Committee on Dams was founded for purpose of promoting and monitoring better state dam safety programs. Right now, I know that all states but Alabama has a dam safety program. Lastly, I'm gonna explain about the hydropower development in the future. Consider because of the land licensing process, which typically takes 5 years only to get a license. So there has been growing concern over the redundancy and inefficiency that may unnecessarily slow or delay the growth of hydropower projects. So disclosing both the private and public investment, including research and development. And actually, since the 1970s, there was no large hydropower that has been developed in the USA. In response to such concerns, the nation's efforts to promote hydropower development have been focused on the small hydropower project and also improvement at existing hydropower plants. So in particular, and also this movement has been led by the fact that about 97% of U.S. dams are non-hydropower dams, so to which electricity generation can be added. And on August 9, 2013, for purpose of this, President Obama signed into law 2 bills. First is the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act, I would call the Efficiency Act, and the Bureau of Reclamation, Small Conduit Hydropower Development and Rural Jobs Act. The first one is basically the Efficiency Act increased the scope of exemption from the licensing requirement for a small hydropower project, which is, small hydropower usually means they generate electricity of 10 megawatts or less. And so they have a relatively less impact on the natural environment. And the second one, Reclamation Act, is in addition to increase the scope of exemption, this act requires the Bureau of Reclamation to apply categorical exclusion for small conduit hydro projects. That means to proceed such a project without preparation of environmental documents such as environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, which are otherwise required under the National Environmental Rights Act. So, in the future, our nation will focus on the small hydro project regarding instead of constructing new, really big project that might impact negatively on the natural environment. Yeah, so that's it. Did I stop too shortly?
No, open for questions.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like there's a trend here moving from larger projects to smaller projects. Do you think we're gonna see, in future years, do you think we're gonna see, like the Fore River, producing power basically? Is that where this is going? We're gonna see a bunch of small projects all over?
I think so. Right now, since 2013, I found about 70 project was proposed, and then the 46 project was approved. So we might, expect the growing of a small hydropower project.
And is that more concentrated on the dams that are already in existence, or?
Yeah.
Yes, over new development,
Yeah.
because there are many hundreds of thousands of dams.
Right.
You said 3%
Yeah, it's only 3%.
are currently geared for hydropower.
Mm-hmm.
In most of, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, do you think there's a concern in the market that there might not be as much interest to invest in these projects if we continue experiencing droughts and
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
it might not be as profitable as it
Mhm.
might once it
Yeah.
appeared?
And also because of a rapid growth of other renewable energy sources, especially solar and wind energy.
And look at the map of California,
Yeah.
with that Sierra Nevada streams coming out of there, and there's Governor Brown yesterday.
Yeah.
The rest of the country is gonna run into the same kind of drought that we are. Don't get too smug, you guys who don't like California.
Mm-hmm.
And you back all of those out, wow.
Yeah. No further questions?
I've got one on the Dam Inspection Act,
Mm-hmm.
and going back to David's point on security issues, we're talking about congressionally authorized database provides information dams nationwide, classifying them by their potential hazard. Again, if I'm a terrorist, if I could punch this up on the website, oh wow, that tells me everything I need to know about where we should be thinking about, can we blow up a dam for maximal
Mm-hmm.
disruption of the American realm? And what an agonizing choice, and I suspect in 1972, no one had that at all on their mind. Gee, we should get as much information out there as we can, there are only good things to come from that.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, maybe not.
No, it doesn't say it's publicly released.
That's, and I'd be interested, have we then put this under considerably greater, you don't get to see this unless you've got security clearances, other things that are there. Other questions? Hang on, thank you, nice, oh, sorry, one, Melissa, you had one more?
Well, and recently there's been some question as to how far jurisdiction of the federal government goes up waterways with regard to the Clean Water Act. And I was just wondering if any of the increased attention for licensing for hydropower for some of these smaller dams might extend that federal jurisdiction up waterways. If you saw anything in the literature linking the two, you know, the question of jurisdiction, how far up the waterways does it go, and how, if the hydropower growth has any impact on that clean water jurisdiction. You might not have seen anything, that's kind of a new question.
Think about it.
Well, thank you, presenters. We've set a high standard for those to come that of course will be better because you will have had more time to prepare for the oral presentation part of this. Please, if you can, get me your rough drafts in at least a couple of days, if possible, before your presentation, so that I've had a chance to look at that and I'm bouncing back messages, you know, here's some things to be thinking about. That doesn't have to be, do research within a day, but as you're putting the final thing together, be working from there. And if I've got my schedule here, we have Kevin and Zach for Wednesday, charging along. Anybody else with questions on presentation schedule? And the rest, let's take a slightly early break then today. Very good.
One tiny thing, just changes of titles. It was the Federal Power Commission was the